So good evening, everyone in Ireland, and good afternoon, everyone in the United States. My name is Nicholas Allen. I'm the director of the Wilson Center for Humanities and Arts at the University of Georgia. But really today, I'm here due to an old love for Jack Yeats. And it's his 150th birthday today, and we didn't want to let that day pass without celebrating him and thanking him really for all the pleasure that he's given so many people over the years. Jack meant a lot to me over the years in reading his work and looking at his work, and also provided a gateway to many friendships. And many of those friendships are resulted today in the conversations that we're going to have. But there were a number of people I wanted to thank just before we began. And first of all, thanks to all of you for being on the panel today, for giving up time on your Sunday near the bank holiday to be with us and celebrate Jack Yeats and his birthday. I want to thank everyone who's come to join us this evening in the conversation, which is really going to be wonderful. I want to thank Patrick Haw, who had the idea for this celebration in the first place. I want to thank Dan Mulhall, the Ambassador of Ireland to the United States, for all that he does for the celebration of Irish art, literature, and culture in the United States and around the world. And really, Jack, as we're going to hear when Eve speaks about him in a little bit, was an artist of the diaspora, and that diaspora has certainly kept an interest in Irish art alive over the many decades of the 20th century and into the 21st. And I wanted to recognize those voices here, and perhaps Cormac O'Malley will tell us a little bit more about that in a moment. I want to thank the National Gallery and the generosity they always showed in giving access to that great archive of the Yeats family and of Jack Yeats, of the work that they've done to celebrate and share his work. And I want to thank very much the Model Gallery and Emer McGarry for the beautiful exhibition that they have in Sligo at the moment that I'd really encourage you to go along and see if you could. And finally, I wanted to thank Hilary Pyle. Whenever I was a graduate student in Trinity about 3,000 years ago, Hilary was one of the earliest people to encourage me in the study of the visual arts and thinking about literature. She would answer any question. She encouraged all interest. She had a great and a wide knowledge, and she was, I think, along with Yvonne and now with Katie, part of a great tradition of art history in Ireland that I think should be central to the study of Irish culture at large. And I just want to say my deep gratitude to Hilary and my deep fondness and affection for her. And it's also been such a pleasure later on to have conversations with John Purser, I can see clapping there, who's also been a great stalwart of the study of Jack Yeats. And we all appreciate you, and I'll appreciate what you have done and what you continue to share with us. So before I hand over to Yvonne and I give over, and you'll know whenever we're coming to a close, whenever I appear again at the end, I want to just give you a quick run through of who's going to speak. So I'm going to pass on shortly to Yvonne Scott, that wonderful scholar in Trinity of Irish art of the 20th and 21st centuries, who will then pass on to Michael Connerty. And Michael is about to publish a book on Jack Yeats's cartoons any day. And Michael, we're all looking forward to that very much. Eve Patten, who directs the Long Room Hub in Trinity and a wonderful friend and colleague for a long time, is going to talk about Jack's sketchbooks and his life in Devon. Adam Coleman, a very able and distinguished young master's student from Maynooth, is going to talk about Bachelor's Walk in Memory. Kerry Neville, my colleague in Georgia, just down the road from me, which still seems odd to say, is going to speak a little bit about an Atlantic Drive. Katie Milligan, whose wonderful book about painting Dublin, is going to talk about the sketchbooks in New York, and they have a connection to Cormac O'Malley and Ernie O'Malley, which perhaps you'll hear about before Cormac speaks about Death for Only One. And Cormac, I still remember you showing me the contours of that painting in your New York apartment with the light that you had, shall we say, borrowed from the National Library, and the deep grooves of the handwork of that painting really stayed with me, even apart from its visual impact together. You really got a sense of its making and of the personality behind the painting, as well as the symbolism of the suggestion. Then hopefully we'll be joined by Conor Linnie, who's not with us yet, but if Conor doesn't appear, then Christin Mulligan is going to talk about by Merrion Strand, and Emily Ridge from Galway is going to talk about the Talkers. Then we have John Purser, who's going to share his homage to Jack Yeats before Dermot Bolger, who's been an old friend of mine, although we don't talk very much or see each other very much, but was very kind to me when I was at the beginning of my career, and I've always remembered that and appreciated it. And his poem, Fairground Ponies, which I believe was published today in the Sunday Business Post, he'll read that before we come to the close. So I'm going to mute myself, which will be a relief to everyone, and I will pass on to Yvonne Scott, a wonderful colleague and a brilliant scholar, to talk about Off the Coast of Mayo.
Thank you very much, Nicholas, for inviting me to speak this evening, and hello to everybody. This is very much a personal response to a painting that I particularly like. I have to say I found it really difficult to choose just one work from his substantial output of over 1,000 oil paintings, well over 1,000, as well as all the graphic work and drawings and so on. But eventually settled on this work off the coast of Mayo, which dates to the late 1930s. And just to quickly position the work, you know, we're reminded that he came to oil painting relatively late in his 30s. I think he was in his 30s. He was in his 50s when he painted the Liffey Swim, which is of 1923. And then the works I'm going to talk about, he's actually in his mid-60s when he carried this out. So it really challenges ageist notions about artistic creativity. So I'm going to explain my interest in Yeats very quickly and then to talk about this particular work. So I find Yeats particularly intriguing because he'd never really panders to the desire for visual description and clarity, and nor does his work conform to conventional ideas about beauty and art. His work is filled with contradictions and challenges, so you can't easily find yourself understanding them and then be able to finish with them and say, well, I understand that, I can move on. They keep drawing you back in. And what we find over the years is that Yeats departed increasingly from a literal descriptive to a much more expressionist, abstracted method of representation. And while that was happening, we find at the same time that the titles that suggest his work, the themes that he was dealing with, become much more emotional, more psychological, less about specific events. So history and narrative diminish in favor of an increasing leaning towards something quite subjective. Yeats, of course, is noted particularly for his response to people in and of the landscape. And while many of the paintings are absolutely devoid of figures, somehow the human is always inferred. The painter and the viewer, they're always there, even if they are outside the frame. And while landscape may be suggested, the details became ever more difficult to discern or identify over time, as we see in this work here. Now, I chose this work for various characteristics. It's a really great example of his many Western coastal images. And while the title identifies the general location, it could really be anywhere along that immense coastline, much of which is characterized by the steep cliffs that you see here. But to me, it's about Jack Yeats himself within an environment that is quite ambiguous. So we see here what looks like the prow of a boat. It enters the image from the lower left. The craft is negotiating a heaving sea. It's moving towards a bright but quite turbulent sky. And like much of his work, and in contrast with many of his contemporaries, it is very evocative, but it doesn't really explain itself. You know, we're left to really negotiate and to get involved in it. Typical of his color, the color is really compelling rather than harmonious. And what we've got are these very dark, aqueous blues and greens, churned up to reveal smears and leakages of yellow and red. Now, his later landscapes are environments, not topographies. And while occasionally analysts attempt to identify particular locations like Ben Bulben or Strand, or as here, the coast of Mayo, arguably they are more generic rather than specific. Now, a common element across this work that differentiates it from landscape imagery generally is that the space doesn't tend to be sectioned off. It's not, you don't see boundary markers really in his work. It's not about title and ownership and entitlement, but it projects a space that is equally accessible really to anybody engaging with it, regardless of their status. Often he's compared with Oskar Kokoschka, who he knew, or at least certainly communicated with, but and Kokoschka, of course, has this international reputation as an expressionist, but arguably Yeats went much further in the dissolution of the image. So now I'm going to hand over to Michael Connerty. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. And indeed, as you mentioned, there are all kinds of contradictions and oppositions at the heart of Jack Yeats's work. And I want to emphasize his humorous side here, the sort of daftness and whimsicality that were expressed on a more or less weekly basis over the roughly 25 years that he worked as a comic strip artist. So this is one of many popular recurring characters that he created. Dicky the Birdman, seen here flying through the air above the rooftops of London. It's a popular context for Yeats. Importantly, I think, important to recognize that something like this strip would have been read by sort of hundreds of thousands of people every week. And while the comics were published, in this case, a comic called Comic Cuts, it was published in London. They were also widely read in Ireland. And Yeats was one of the most successful comic strip artists of this period. So this is a time when the medium was at an early stage in its evolution, and he's right there, alive to this the potentials of this dynamic and novel medium. So he's one of a number of pioneers in London at this point, which I think is an important thing to note about his early career. He was about 2 decades into his time as a comic strip artist when he executed this one. So he'd already enjoyed great success with numerous series, including his Sherlock Holmes parody, Chublock Holmes, and the would-be civilized monkey Lickety Switch, and various other characters that, as I say, were big comic strip stars, cartoon stars of their time. And I don't think it's too much of a stretch to see this particular character, Dicky the Birdman, as a kind of proto superhero, which puts these images sort of way ahead of their time. And as with later comparable figures like Superman and Captain America and so on, one of the chief visual sources for Dicky was the circus, particularly aerial display and trapeze artistry. And the circus, as many of you will know, was something that Yeats drew on throughout his life in his work in oils, illustrations, sketches, and very much in his comic strips. But as well as the circus, I think it's worth noting the presence of elements of the sort of nascent science fiction genre here as well. Yeats was, as were the public, to which he was addressing these cartoons, very interested in gadgetry and technology. And here there's the sort of flying contraption that Dicky, he's sort of an older gentleman, with a sort of military moustache, so not a sort of a typical superhero type in that respect. But this sort of intrusion of gadgetry and technology into the modern world and into the lives of ordinary people was something that was a kind of a theme that ran through quite a few of his strips. And as I say, the form itself was quite new, or certainly a lot of elements of it were at the time. Note the speech balloons. I mean, I absolutely loved the slack-necked snoring pigeon in the second and third panels there, the way it's kind of exclaiming that the snore via speech balloons. Speech balloons themselves were a very recent sort of American import that Jack Yeats was one of the first British comic strip artists to adopt. And the eye for local detail, I think, is really worth noting here. As I say, you've got the rooftops of London and then the various little signifiers of the industrial north as we move up towards Newcastle for the final panel. Also his keen interest in sports, urban, working class culture, pigeon racing in this case, are very important elements of his comic art. He loved popular forms of entertainment and spectacle, and I think it's important to note the degree to which he himself contributed to this environment, this popular cultural environment, through what was then one of its freshest and most dynamic forms, the comic strip. So I hope you've enjoyed looking at Dicky the Birdman, and I'll pass you on to Eve.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. That's fascinating. And thanks also to Nicholas for this opportunity for us to look at Jack Yeats's work. And I thought I'd use my allotted 3 minutes just to remind everyone, not that you need reminding, that while Jack Yeats painted, of course, some of the most famous scenes in the Irish visual canon, we also see a little bit of England in his work, probably more, I think, than we see in William Butler Yeats's writings, even though, of course, both brothers spent quite a bit of time living in England. And I'm just going to frame this section with the Christmas card on the left. This is a Koala Press Christmas card image that Jack Yeats did with his sister Elizabeth. It's from around about 1908 or a little bit later, and it's one of several that you'll know which feature the dove in this period. And I was casting around for images of Ireland and England together, and surprisingly this came up. But you'll see it falls back on the kind of standard image of Ireland there in the foreground as the snow-covered cottage, but a version of England that perhaps looks more like a Manhattan, even though this is England. It's industrial, it's red brick, it's smoking, it's a little bit bleak, and there's the sea, the great gulf between the two nations. And in fact, of course, this was nothing like the England that Jack Yeats settled in when he moved down to Devon and began to depict the coastline of Devon and bits of Cornwall as well on the south coast. He moved down to Devon to live full-time, I think from around 1897, with his wife Cotty and the wonderful dog Hooligan. And I know people will think of that lovely photograph of the couple and the dog looking tremendously happy, it seemed to me, and very settled in the everyday routines of rural English life and coastal life down in Devon. And a few years ago, when the National Gallery in Dublin put on that wonderful exhibition of the, I think, over 200 sketchbooks from Jack Yeats's archive, I went to see the exhibition with a friend who is a painter and lives in Devon. And she went through what was in the exhibition and immediately could identify all the bits of coastline and the beaches and the bits of shore that we see in Jack Yeats's English set sketches. Because of course, in her own landscape painting, she'd painted them too. And it really made me realize how much Jack Yeats was painting this bit of England as a real place, a real topography, that these were not impressionistic. And I was very interested to hear Yvonne talk about the difference in his work between what is specific in landscape and what's more generic. So what I'm just going to show is the slide on the right of my screen anyway. This is Free Day in Ley, December 1902, in watercolor ink and graphite. And this is a picture of Slapton Ley in Devon, which is an inshore freshwater lake, and it's cut off from the sea by a sandbar. You're only actually seeing half of the sketch itself because it covers 2 pages in the sketchbook. And also I've cropped it slightly, which in fact increases the immediate effect you might have on looking at this image, that at first glance, you might take it for the English Defence Forces trying to resist an aerial invasion. But of course, when you look closer, you realize it's a party of duck shooters who are being accompanied, and this is just to the left of this image, accompanied by the Coast Guard and the local policeman. And you get that lovely sense, I think, of a marrying of what we've just been hearing about, that lovely sense of topography and landscape that Jack Yeats could capture so well, with the verging on cartoonish figurative imagery and the people that he captured. And although I don't advocate duck shooting or blood sports of any kind, I think this is a delightful early sketch and shows what kind of riches the English landscape provided Jack Yeats. So with that, I will now, being Eve, hand over to Adam. Thank you.
Right. Thanks, Eve. And I'd like to thank Nicholas also for inviting me onto this distinguished panel and allowing me to participate. I'd like to speak briefly on a painting of Yeats's that most resonates with me. This is Bachelor's Walk in Memory. It was painted in 1915 and now hangs in the National Gallery of Ireland. I admire this painting for what it doesn't say, and thereafter for what it conveys but does not make it explicit. It gets under my skin, like any good piece of art, and my endeavour to explain why it can only be a peripheral and inconclusive. The context of the painting, what it was composed in Memoriam 2, was a massacre which took place in July 1914 when a column of British troops was accosted by a hostile civilian crowd on Bachelor's Walk following the Hood gun running operation. 4 people were killed and more than 30 injured in the ensuing confrontation. It provided a vital propaganda opportunity for Irish nationalists to drape another shroud of villainy over the standing army in Ireland, while simultaneously vindicating the moral righteousness of their own cause. Yeats doesn't play to this tune, or at least not in a way that would be expected or perhaps obvious. We see here a solemn flower girl, her head lowered, her face stern, laying roses where the dead probably fell on Bachelor's Walk. We see a boy who may or may not be with her, looking down the quay with a fervid eye, seemingly wrapped in anticipation of something just out of sight or something to come. All the while, the life of the city continues on in the background, with people crossing the Hackney Bridge, totally oblivious to the sanctity carried by this moment. Yeats could have appropriated this event for the purposes of explicit moral vindication, thus fueling the forces of social and political division energetically at work in Ireland in 1915. But he doesn't do so. He sees the massacre as a tragedy, a human tragedy, and at heart an Irish tragedy, one that shouldn't be weaponized by one side to antagonize the other, but one that will inevitably will be. Yeats takes a side as nationalist, but he does so in a manner that expresses the poignancy of this event, its overwhelming pathos, and one that may betray the sense of conflictedness inherent to his own form of nationalism as a Protestant Anglo-Irishman, with little interest in the cultural, as a Protestant Anglo-Irishman with a little interest in the cultural revival and with strong connections to Britain. Whatever Yeats's intentions were with this painting, this is a painting I think of whenever I try and conceptualize the Irish Revolution for purposes of memory and commemoration. The revolution was a human tragedy caused by social and political polarization. We should always consider the first before considering the latter, I think. And with that, I hand over to Kerry. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas, for inviting me to participate in this wonderful celebration. I'm going to be really telling a story more than talking knowledgeably about this painting in Atlantic Drive by Yeats. It's sort of dated to 1944, 1945, and it hangs in Limerick's Hunt Museum. And I first saw it when I was living in Limerick a few years ago, hanging in a gallery on a white wall. I'm just going to begin with a few lines from Tim Robinson's book, Stones of Iran, Pilgrimage. He recounts how when he's on Inishmore, he encounters a man who tells the story of fishing on El Anara and sees a capel araga, or a seahorse, and its foal swimming below, whereupon he wound up his line and never went rock fishing again. And he tells a story of a man called Diranan and his crew got in terrible fright when a seahorse came up beside their boat. Sometimes it used to happen that a mare kept in a field near the shore would produce an unexpected foal, and the style araga, or sea stallion, would be held responsible. I sort of begin with the story of the capel araga, the seahorse, because this painting to me, it's quite dreamy, as if it's participating in this liminal space. You see the horse coming in, like the narrative plot is quite clear, right? It's an Atlantic Drive. So we have the Atlantic on the left and we have Ireland on the right, and they're headed north in this horse cart, and the horse is moving, the reins are held tight. The horse's head is just out of sight. But they're traveling on this cliff road. And this is a walk I did myself the Atlantic Way a few years ago, about 100 miles of it. And it's quite treacherous. There's not really a railing on the left side of the Atlantic, and there's only barbed wire fencing on the right to hold on. The trail is pretty narrow. And at one point there was part of the trail had fallen away, and there was about a 2-foot gap that I had to step across or else fall. And my legs were shaking, and it was quite terrifying. And you know, when I first saw this painting hanging in the Hunt Museum, I was, as Adam mentioned, transfixed by it. Not so much, you know, knowledge about the painting. There's not much written about it. So this is all kind of my own storytelling speculation. But it appears to me as if, you know, the horse, the woman, the people in the cart are in this liminal space. They're both, you know, we don't see the road that they're traveling on. We just see the sky, and we see the ocean, and we see the sea foam. And the woman in her dress looks as if she's kind of smeared into the sky and into the sea, the ocean at the same time. So in a kind of liminal traveling space, you know, they're traveling north, the cardinal direction, which at least in sort of Celtic understanding is, you know, earth, home, security, fecundity. In divinatory practice, north is connected to a kind of no time. So this liminal space, the woman is traveling, looking out into the ocean, across to what, you know, we can see she's certainly looking into the water, but beyond that, what? A kind of dream speculation. But the painting itself is quiet, right? We can't hear the noise of the waves. We can't hear the snorting breath of the horse, or its hooves on the road, or the chatter perhaps of the other passengers in that cart, or the woman who seems perhaps to be silently engaged in a kind of reflection in that liminal space. You know, one of the things I was thinking about, you know, the Capel Ariga, the seahorse, you know, this coastal journey, you know, they were these creatures in mythology or in real life, right? That sort of move between the two worlds, the world of the water and the world of the sky and land. And they can bring people into the water. And so just another small few lines from Tim Robinson's book, where he speaks about a man, Brian, who's out fishing. And he sees these strange horses trespassing up on his land near the cliff edge. And Robinson writes of the story. He went up to them, put a halter on a mare, and jumped on her back. But these were seahorses. The halter slipped off, and the mare galloped straight to the cliff with Brian clinging to her mane and plunged beneath the waves. We all go over the cliff in the end. You know, and it seems it's, you know, the way this horse cart is so close to the edge of land. And the water comes right up as if to the edge of the woman's skirts. And I think of, you know, my own self on that trail, you know, those harrowing moments where it seemed one misstep and I would be snatched by a seahorse perhaps and carried out underwater. So, you know, the past year and a half, I was supposed to have done that hike back in May 2020 again, and was grounded, of course, by COVID. And so this is a painting that I return to and dream about because, you know, hopefully in another year, I'll get to do that walk again. So thank you. And I'll pass on to Kathryn.
Thank you so much, Kerry. So we're going to go from the Atlantic edge onto the water and across to America, where so many of you are joining us from this evening. And I'd just like to echo the thanks of the previous speakers to Nicholas for bringing us all together on this really special occasion. I have taken heed of the time warning, and I'm going to read what I want to say about this beautiful sketch. So many years ago now, as some of you know, I had the pleasure to work as a research fellow at the Library and Archives at the National Gallery of Ireland. One of the highlights of this position was working closely with the wonderful Yeats archive, donated to the institution by Jack's niece, Anne Yeats, in 1996. And to my mind, an archive that is one of the richest and most extensive artistic archives on the island of Ireland. Of course, it contains more than just Jack. The papers of Mary Cottenham Yeats, Elizabeth and Susan Yeats, and Anne Yeats herself are also important constituent parts, but our focus this evening is Jack. To work with the archive on an almost daily basis was a great privilege. Its riches are not just the artworks, letters, and other manuscripts, but the small, personal, and seemingly insignificant items and materials from Jack and Cottie's life together. So when Nicholas asked me to be part of this event, there was no question that I wanted to speak about something from the Yeats archive. But what would it be? The artist's painting smock, perhaps, a book from his library inscribed with Christmas or birthday wishes from his wife or brother, from Ezra Pound or Samuel Beckett, a collection of small figures created for a children's miniature theatre, stencils, a literary magazine, or even a photograph showing the brooding young artist captured in a fashionable New York studio. While all fascinating and undoubtedly fitting for an event like this, the heart of the Yeats archive is the sketchbooks, and Yves has alluded to this as well. This is a collection of about 200 pocket-sized notebooks, miraculously intact and dating from the 1870s through to the 1930s, detailing and capturing Yeats's daily life in Ireland, Britain, and beyond. He kept these as a visual diary, a harbour for observations and occurrences. They're small, they're intimate, they're made to be held, to be filled at speed after being pulled out on street corners, in tram carriages or theatre stalls, and to be placed on cafe tables. 8 of these sketchbooks, all dating from March and April 1904, show us a visit to New York, where Jack was invited by his patron, John Quinn, to hold an exhibition of his work and spend a few weeks exploring the city. This transatlantic trip is the perfect thing to consider for this transatlantic event. Although the exhibition was not a success, that would come later, through the pages of these sketchbooks, we follow Jack and Cottie across the ocean on the decks of the SS Mesaba, past Cape Cod, the Nantucket Shoals, and onto the docks, into Brooklyn, along the Harlem Speedway, to Staten Island, the Palisades, into Chinatown, to Broadway shows and Italian marionette theatres. We see Ellis Island, where he documented the arrival of many of his countrymen, the bars of the Bowery, and even the more rarefied environs of the Waldorf Astoria and their brilliant barman who looks to be making him a cocktail. This sketch, taken from sketchbook number 73, was made on the deck of the Staten Island ferry. It offers us a view towards Manhattan, with 2 of the key aspects of the New York cityscape clearly labeled. We see here the Brooklyn Bridge spanning across the river, and beside it, the skyscrapers of Manhattan. Alongside this view of the city is a quickly copied advertisement on its side, so we get this sense of the artist moving this sketchbook, maybe made in a completely different part of the city, and it reads, "A square chew in a square package." And this is just one of a plethora of similar ephemera that the artist copied over the course of his visit. These sketchbooks, like the archive itself, reveal Yeats as a magpie, a gatherer, a hoarder of the visual, and a collector of stuff. New York offered a rich seam of material for such a person, and from these sketchbooks, we see how Yeats relished in the opportunities and possibility of the metropolis. These are a perfect companion to his depictions of Dublin and London, which I have looked at previously, and they remind us that Yeats as an urban flaneur is just as compelling as Yeats, the recorder of the rural and the national. So it's my absolute pleasure now to hand over to Cormac O'Malley, who will speak about Death for Only One.
Thank you, Kathryn. No doubt, Nicholas placed you before me or me after you because I have the companion sketchbook to which you referred, and Jack Yeats gave this on his trip to New York to my father in 1945 after he had helped at the National exhibit, which was held in Dublin. And he has many of those same scenes, in fact, with the ship coming into New York, etc. Anyway, well, look, today my assignment is to talk about this painting, Death for Only One. It was painted on oil on canvas, 24 by 36, so fairly large, by Jack in 1937. Went on an exhibit in 1938, was not sold, fortunately for me. And when my father, Ernie O'Malley, came up from the countryside in Mayo to visit with Jack, whom he had met a couple of years earlier, and have afternoon tea, he was asking Jack what works he had done recently. And Jack picked out a couple from behind his screen and showed him this one. And my father just fell in love with it, and he recorded that in those words in a letter to Tom McGreevy. And he just had to negotiate right then and there with Jack so that he could take it away and buy it on an installment program. And we have the letters back and forth between Jack and Ernie paying £15 a month for a series of months. The total price was £150 back in 1939. Anyway, what's the meaning of this painting? And in fact, quite often this painting is much darker than the one that we see here. And there's Jack referred, and other people have referred to being two travelers. I sort of think of it as two travelers or two comrades. And there's this darkness on the right side of the screen, which the surviving person is facing. And that would, to me, suggest that, you know, there's a brooding, a deepness, a sense of loss, that the future doesn't look very bright, and that the relationship with his companion was very close, and there may not be a good future ahead. I'm more of an optimist and always looked at the left side of the painting, which is this bright morning sky coming. And I sort of see this as the survivor looking for the future, that it really is death for only one. As sad as the event is on the passing of the individual, that this survivor has survived, and that there is a dawning. And you can see Jack Yeats has put the yellow sections, the flowers on the bog, and this is really very, you could say, an optimistic. The man is sort of waking up in the morning and sort of saying, look, life is tough, companion has gone. That maybe my father thought of this in terms of comrades that he had missed, you know, the Jack Lynches and the other comrades that he had fought with during the war. And he too, in a warlike situation, as we all know, when you have to confront death, you still move on and you need to survive. So this is a life of the survivor. In my own life, I mean, painting has been in the family for 80 years, but when my wife died a couple of years ago, I really just couldn't live with this painting, walking into a room where we had had such a friendship. And I felt very poignant about the title for Death for Only One, because though I'd always thought of this as being on the brighter side, as a widower, I was looking toward the darker side of the painting. And so, sadly enough, for myself and my family, we sort of had to part ways. And I guess I could say death of only one painting, in a sense that it was time for it to move on. So that's my take on Death for Only One. And I pass on to Conor Linnie, if he is here. And if not, are you aboard?
I am. Thank you, Cormac, and thank you so much for that really deeply moving reflection on a wonderful painting. And thank you so much, Nicholas, for organising such a wonderful event. So my research explores the group of writers and artists who circulated between Dublin and London in the post-war years. So I'm interested in painters such as Lucian Freud, Francis Bacon, the young Dubliner Patrick Swift, and of course, the elder at that point, Jack B. Yeats. For this younger emerging generation of artists in the 1940s and 50s, Yeats was at once a towering figure and an enigmatic presence. Lucian Freud apparently came to Dublin in 1947 in admiration of Yeats, but only saw the elder artist once from a distance walking alone through St. Stephen's Green. He was obviously too shy to approach for the first time in his life. Yet if Yeats could remain an elusive public figure in these years, his late works are by contrast forceful and vivid manifestations of a personality in paint. The iconic oil on canvas work, The Singing Horseman, which you see before you, was painted in 1949, is really emblematic of the artist's triumphant late style. Now, please forgive me, but I'm going to get nostalgic and lyrical now, as I recall the first time I saw this painting when I was just about 16 years old, wandering through the National Gallery without a catalogue and with little sense of visual art or what it would come to mean to me. So suddenly I was confronted by this exhilarating image of abandon, an immediate call to attention that I really, on thinking about it, could only compare to hearing that opening snare drum rap that opens Bob Dylan's Like a Rolling Stone. Seeing this painting with that similar kind of moment of awakening, which I'm sure many of you have experienced with different paintings of Yeats's yourselves. And the painting is really just a wonderful study of movement. We see the rider with you know, hands clasped to his chest, looking to the heavens, and the horse itself seems to be almost dissolving as it moves out of the canvas. And immediately just the movement of the painting just captured my attention so vividly. And I really experienced for the first time what has become since wonderfully familiar, that moment when Yeats's brushwork and pigment starts to move before you and about you as you concentrate on the canvas. A movement that for me always seems to defy its materials and induces a strange delirium all of its own. What struck me most then about the work, and what has held me since, is Yeats's single daring flick of the palette knife to mark the writer's left elbow in red. So you can see that right in the center of the painting. And I really feel like all the passion in the painting is distilled into that one single gesture, that one single flick of color, which is really the only major red feature in the whole piece. It dazzled me at 16 and, you know, still dazzles me today looking at it now. And I really feel like it is an enduring example of Yeats's masterful late gestural style and the achievement of his work in really expressing the pure poetry of paint. So I'd like to pass on to Christine Mulligan now. It's a great pleasure to do so.
Thanks very much, Conor, and thank you, Nicholas, also for organizing this event and for all of you for being here. In By Merrion Strand from 1929 and throughout his ove, as Yvonne said, Jack Yeats really mediates between the impressionistic and the more abstract expressionist environmental, which this painting is kind of a mid paint between. And here he displays women's working class labor and the concomitant struggle for socioeconomic, but also cultural capital in an island state that is also, of course, part of a historically colonial, but also decolonizing archipelago, and part of a network where these long-standing modes and methods are still circulating within the painting's specific mise-en-scene and its oceanic microclimate as an inherent construction in the presentation. If, as Roisin Kennedy has observed, one is familiar with the actual flower sellers at Merrion Strand throughout the teens and the 20s, more clearly recognizable in the other female figures, the other female figure also slightly in the background, I would insist what is sold here are leisure and beauty, which represent both traditional national bounties of Ireland simultaneously, land and sea, proffering them and women as what I have argued in my book, Geofeminism, are the configuration of a long traditional economy, and what I have described elsewhere as an economy of feminized influences and iconographies that reaches long back to other traditions. Who is this woman with the flowers exactly? As the only figure with a full view of her face, does she serve as an icon shown in semi-composite perspective with her body slightly turned toward us? Is she myth, reality, a bit of both with those come hither eyes and ruby lips? The literary traditions of marketing and commodifying the female figure attributed by Nancy J. Vickers in the catalogs of Petrarchan and other blazons, I would insist, are part of Yeats's frothing combinations of cloud and sea foam or spindrift. Yet, instead of being simply emblematized and divided from such modes of production, and I think this is really where my personal response to the painting comes in, the realities of these women's labors, this specific woman with her gaze that deliberately beckons the viewer to dive in like the bathers at her back, even further in terms of her handmade, individualized construction of the bouquet that is inseparable from her hands, and arguably thus Yeats's hands, which applied the paint itself, becomes swirled quite intentionally through the dynamic blues, ivories, whites, and grays, with pops of other bright primary colors like the central woman's shawl of verdant green. And an Irish speaker would call this glas unia, or technically meadow green, but glas unia is a hybrid term that means natural green and man-made green together. So the natural and the produced, like in the painting, are meeting as one. So the aesthetic is where the produced and the natural are joined. And we can think about modes of production and the natural world coming together for Yeats in By Merrion Strand in the same way that the impressionistic and the abstract come together. And I'm going to turn, and with that as a way to think about the transitions in his life and career. And with that, I'm going to turn over to Emily Ridge, who's going to be talking about the talker.
Thank you very much, Christin, and thanks also, of course, to Nicholas for bringing us all here today. It's an honor to be in such good company this evening and to be able to celebrate the life and work of one of my favorite artists. I'm far from being an expert on Jack B. Yeats's work, unlike many of the other distinguished panelists, but I would call myself a long-standing fan, and it's in that very personal capacity that I'm speaking today. So the painting I would like to spotlight this evening is a 1951 painting entitled The Talkers. And as you can see, it's rendered in Yeats's later, more expressionistic style. And like several of his other paintings, it fixates on a crowd, and there's something very dynamic about his presentation of the gathered figures. And here I'm going to get a little nostalgic, like Conor before me, I first came across this work many years ago at the Hugh Lane Gallery in Dublin. I was a student at the time and was so mesmerized by the painting that when at a later date I returned and it wasn't on the wall, I rather precociously emailed the gallery demanding to know where it was, only to be told that this was one of a number of pieces on rotation between gallery and storeroom. And I remember being shocked to learn that such a beautiful work of art might only periodically see the light of day. What fascinated me about this painting at the time, above all, was the degree to which it captured the esprit or spirit and energy of a party. And to my eyes as a young student, it perhaps captured something of the overstimulation that I was then experiencing at university and the new social scene that came with it. So we as viewers are really thrust into the tumult and buzz of the scene itself in this painting. There's a vibrancy and an excess to this canvas. The colors are almost garish in parts. The figures are also like caricatures, from the doll-like face in the bottom right-hand corner to the demonic grin of the man on the bottom left. The frame is overcrowded, and this visual excess, of course, mimics the excess of an actual party, the vibrating impressions and blurred edges of such an experience. There's a sonic quality to this too. The painting is called The Talkers, and you can almost feel the noise and chatter rise from the canvas, the way the central tuxedoed man turns his head as if distracted by a stray word or incident. And we too, as viewers, find ourselves grasping after what might have been said or by what might be happening in the far corner of the room. What have we missed? At a good party, one's attention is always necessarily fractured, following the ever-shifting sounds and sensations that are constantly in motion, never confined to one place. Yet, as I look at this image today, after well over a year of social distancing and prohibitions on large indoor gatherings, the question I ask myself is not quite what have we missed, but what are we missing? The raucous, sweaty, often anonymous intimacy of a crowded room does indeed today feel like an expressionistic dream. So happy birthday, Jack. And now I will pass the baton to John Purser.
Thank you, Emily. I'm going to talk about There Is No Night. I was very touched by Cormac's contribution, and I feel personally a connection between this painting and Death for Only One. I can't quite explain why. Kokoschka wrote to Jack Yeats quite late on in Jack's life when he'd more or less stopped painting, asking him to take his brushes out once more and tell stories that he could tell like nobody else. This painting, There Is No Night, is a story by implication, but there is, of course, no actual story. We've been told about how the abstract in Yeats began to take over from the narrative. That is true. So I made my own narrative for this, if you like, and also tried to draw some hope out of what is a very strange and quite brooding painting, one that I absolutely love. Homage to Jack Yeats. The light, half indigo, half white, bog asphodel, delicate tormentil, hinted in heather shadows, a glint of peat-stained water and the glow of pale bog cotton tufts. Soon a short, cool breeze and dawn. The man, half raised with gentle summons, extends an arm crooked at the elbow, wrist curved, palm cupped to receive and give due homage. The white horse, alert from its own wanderings, tosses a willful head, acknowledging their bond, though his unwinking eyes see other and beyond. The man has slept no more than needful, tall boots still on. Who knows what strange salvation travels by horse and man through ignorant lands? their needs unthought of, sufferings unbought. But they have fodder from those secret hours, alone, cool, passionate, comes an old knowing that will hold their fancies through the hot stumbling of a dusty road, whose fiery angel's book and vial, all the prophetic threats, will be of little consequence to the white horse, the shadow man. For they have seen before the dawn, and in the long day span of the north summer light, know now and forever there is no night. And thank you. Now I'll pass on to Dermot.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to follow such a distinguished fellow playwright and poet. And thank you, Nicholas, for asking me along, and for all the wonderful speakers. It's been extraordinary to hear so much by people who know so much about Yeats, and then to come along as a man who knows so little about Yeats. I would love to possess an original Jack B. Yeats. I don't, but I do possess an original copy of the first edition of On Another Man's Wound. So I'd love to show it to the author's son from 1936. When Cotty died, Jack Yeats entered a nursing home on Portobello Bridge in Dublin, and Thomas McGreevy, who was mentioned earlier on, would visit him every night with all the news. And some of the other patients complained that your man had the BBC on every night because McGreevy would talk for so long and so interestingly. And Kathryn has mentioned his notebooks and that instinct to draw. And so this is about his least known painting, which a sketch which he did 2 days before his death, and it's called Fairground Ponies, as a memory of Jack B. Yeats. It's a huge honor to be here with so many people tonight. Fairground Ponies. It might seem more apt to praise your monumental late canvases, where, freed from pictorial reality, you plastered in rich, vibrant layers the raw, emotive colors of memory. Your landscapes no longer external, but infused, not with scenes you once saw, but with the tumultuous passion and grief that such memories now conjured up, echoing the cathartic chaos of dreams as they burst into such startling hues of jade and jasmine and kingfisher blue, that mere brushstrokes were not enough to keep up as you molded glistening daubs of paint into shape using your fingertips. So why do I consider your last ever sketch to be equally wondrous? Two wooden fairground ponies swirl in joyous pursuit, and a carousel designed to extract pennies and delight from children in small towns. Their innocent joy still engaging your mind that remained enthralled by the breath of life. A frail old man propped up by heaped pillows at the window of a Portobello nursing home, your fingers barely possessing the strength to hold a pencil steady over a blank sheet, a mere 48 hours before your death, but continuing to do what came as naturally as speech or sleep, creating faint sketches that evoke joy almost to your final breath. And I'll hand back with great thanks to Nicholas.
Hello, everyone. Well, that was really beautiful and a wonderful set of evocations about Jack Yeats. Perhaps only in Ireland could you have a birthday party where we talk about his end. But that was a beautiful arc of his life, of the many things that he's meant to so many people. And it reminded me, actually, in listening to Cormac and listening to John, who's been great company over these last months, and we've met on Zoom at too far a distance, but of the importance of friendship. And perhaps the best thing that we can say about Jack Yeats is that he has inspired so many generations of friendship since. I can see all of those brilliant younger scholars who have been to speak with us today about that great depth and interest they have of his work. I can think about Michael's new book to come. I can think of all those years of mentorship that Yvonne had in the arts in Trinity that has produced all of this continuing knowledge. I think of the National Gallery of Ireland and of the investment of the Irish state and also of the United States and of England, of all of these places together through the work of this artist. So I'm really quite moved today to be with you all as friends and to celebrate Jack Yeats through friendship. I wanted to finish just as we went with one last picture. Because the one thing actually that I loved about Conor's description, or I should say Michael's description of the playfulness of Jack Yeats, is that since he's the only artist I ever spent accompanying in an archive for a whole day, and I didn't tire of him. And I think I didn't tire of him ever because he had that sense of playfulness and of other places. So wherever you are in the world today, I would like you to, like this pirate in these far distant waters, to raise a glass of whatever suits you. And maybe if everyone here would unmute, and we'll all give a cheer for happy birthday, Jack Yeats. So are you all unmuted? Happy birthday, Jack.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
Okay, well, I wish you all very well. Thank you all on the panel for being here. That was really beautiful. Thank you all for joining us there, wherever you are in the world. And dear Jack, thank you all for your art. Good night.
And thank you, Nicholas.
Thank you, Nicholas.
Thank you.
Lovely to meet you.
Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you.
And may we
everyone.
meet together on post-COVID world, Nicholas, and it will be year round.
Well,